Good evening. I'm Mary Finger, president of Seton Hill University. And on behalf of the Sisters of Charity of Seton Hill and the university, I welcome you to the Sister Mary Schmidt Lecture for 2021. Joining this audience of faculty, staff, students, alumni, and friends, all members of the Seton Hill family, are 5 past recipients of the Elizabeth Seton Medal, awarded by the university. They include Rosemary Corsetti, Catherine Freivogel, Catherine Ryan, and Sisters of Charity, Gemma Del Duca and Sister Rosemary Donnelly. Welcome, everyone. This lecture, scheduled for 2020, was postponed due to the coronavirus pandemic. And although the pandemic is still very much a part of our lives, we are pleased that our speaker, Dr. Catherine O'Donnell, agreed to be with us this evening via Zoom. Catherine's lecture, We Cannot Quarantine Compassion, is a timely one for all of us as we celebrate the 200th anniversary of the death of St. Elizabeth Ann Seton and the 150th anniversary of the Sisters of Charity of Seton Hill, the founders of our university. The Sister Mary Schmidt Lecture Series is a collaboration between the Sisters of Charity and Seton Hill University. It was established in 2007 with 3 goals in mind: support the Catholic identity of Seton Hill University, engage the Sisters of Charity and Seton Hill University in learning and dialogue on timely topics of social and environmental justice with global impact, and develop an understanding of Catholic social teachings and how they pertain to this dialogue. The lecture series honors the memories of Sister of Charity, Sister Mary Schmidt, who served Seton Hill in many capacities between 1936 and 1991, including as president from 1971 through 1977. I now ask Sister Barbara Einloth, Provincial Counselor of the Sisters of Charity of Seton Hill, to introduce our guest lecturer, Dr. Catherine O'Donnell.
Thanks, President Finger. I am delighted to welcome and to introduce Catherine O'Donnell to all of our gathering tonight for this year's lecture. As Mary said, when the pandemic upended all plans for in-person events last year, we had to postpone, but Catherine was certainly our first choice for this year, and she happily agreed to do it in this new to us format. Catherine came to our attention with the publication of her biography of St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, which I'm sure you have seen, and her work places Elizabeth in her historical context in a way that is a style that is both rich and readable, both dense and enticing. So you want to keep reading. It reflects, I think, Catherine's own connection with Mother Seton in a way that is reminiscent for me of the connection that Sister Mary Schmidt also had. And her affinity for it is reflected in a little pamphlet that she wrote, Elizabeth Seton, The Holiness of an American Woman. Sister Vivian Linkhauer and I met Catherine in Emmitsburg in 2019, where we saw her in action. And we invited her immediately to be our next speaker. And as President Finger said, this is a particularly auspicious moment for her to talk about Mother Seton and the many dimensions that Catherine has tapped into, the many dimensions of Mother Seton's life and heart. And for me, Catherine's capacity for making the connections between Elizabeth's experiences and our own in these days of pandemic, and between the challenges she faced and the ones we face, to be inclusive and to care about the big world in very practical ways. That really impresses me. And she jumped at making those connections, which made me excited. So I look forward to all that Catherine's going to share with us this evening as she reminds us that we can't quarantine compassion. Catherine?
Thank you so much, President Finger and Sister Barbara and all of you for inviting me to give this talk. Whenever I talk about St. Elizabeth Seton to a group that includes any sisters, I am humbled to the point of near paralysis. And my daughter, who grew from kindergartner to high schooler as I wrote that biography, has more than once reminded me, Mom, you literally wrote the book on this. But that's enough. And particularly because of the nature of this talk tonight, my sense of not quite deserving this privilege is quite acute. Unlike others who have been included in this, I'm not here because of my own contributions, but because my work as an historian drew me into the world of Elizabeth Seton, and so into the world of the Sisters and Daughters of Charity. And so I think what is wanted from me tonight is not to lecture as a scholar, but rather to hold a mirror to the extent that I can up to these worlds in which it has been my privilege to spend time. Because it is those women, those people, and all of you of Seton Hill University who embody these teachings. So I talk tonight not as an expert, but at best as a witness. And with that in mind, as I carry on my way, please feel free to write comments and questions in the chat, and we'll loop back to them. So as I thought about this talk, I thought about the fact that we're not living, if I can borrow a phrase from the liturgical calendar, in ordinary time, or maybe we always are and are not. The way Elizabeth Seton always lived in a world of school children and tight budgets and unfinished buildings, but also in a dimension of prayer and contemplation. So what is not ordinary, as we have already heard, is that it is the 200th anniversary of the death of Saint Elizabeth Seton. And 2020, a year from which we have still not quite escaped, saw the 150th anniversary of the founding of the Sisters of Charity of Seton Hill. And from your many images, I took the liberty of choosing one that also foregrounded the Korean province. And so anniversaries are not, unfortunately, the only extraordinary dimension of this time, as we've also been living and working amidst pandemic. And I think COVID-19 returned us in ways no one wanted to something closer to Seton's world, in which disease just stalked her loved ones in a way scarcely understood and entirely feared. And since March of 2020, death seemed, even to young, healthy people living in a privileged society, to press close in on us. No longer a destination we know is at the end of a long life, but a place into which we might slip, or our loved ones might slip at any moment. And so the pandemic brought to mind the material reality of Seton's world, and I think her profound respect for science and for prayer, her awareness of the needs of both body and soul. And it reminded me all the time of a phrase from her life that I have heard sisters refer to as well, the grace of the moment. In the hardship and the loneliness and the fear and the sheer tedium, there was grace for those who, and again, I turned attention to others, lacking wisdom myself, knew how to seek it. So in honor of those anniversaries and in recognition of the extraordinary demands of our own last year, I'll move in this talk between three realms. And the first is the world of Elizabeth Seton, and there I draw my own research, though that's built on others. Second is the realm of Sisters Seton's spiritual daughters, and here I will just hope I don't get things too wrong, and I draw very much on the formal and informal archivists of the communities. And the last realm is our own time, the time of the pandemic. And to illustrate that, I'll draw on a project that I helped to create, which is a digital archive of people's experiences, just everyday people's experiences of COVID-19. And I had the idea of doing this one day last March. I think it was the day Tom Hanks was diagnosed and things were just falling apart. But it was very much my colleagues who knew how to make it a reality. And I was influenced by my sense as an historian that world events require archives so that people of the future know what has happened to us. But I was also moved by what I learned as a person from my years of research into Elizabeth Seton, and that is to ask, how can I help? Are there ways to build connections to people, to allow people to tell their stories? So anyway, there's this archive which now has about 15,000 entries from people all over the world. That includes journal entries and drawings and annotated news clippings, songs, all kinds of things. So I'll choose some things from that. And my talk then has just two parts. First, I'll share an account of Elizabeth Seton's life. And I know that many of you know her well and better than I. But in talking about this lecture with the wonderful organizers, we agreed it's appropriate for me to tell her story to honor the anniversary of her death. And because who doesn't like to hear a story? And second, I've chosen just 3 elements of Catholic social teaching. And for each, I'll try to find a demonstration in Seton's life, sometimes in a lesser known moment, an illustration from our digital archive of life now in the wide world, and an illustration from the sisters. And I realize it may sound terribly organized, but in fact, as I wrote the second part of the talk, I couldn't always go in the same order. So we'll sort of move through these realms as the wind takes us. So let me tell you the story. Seton's life was short, only 46 years long, but it was filled with drama and risk. She was born Elizabeth Bayley to an Episcopalian, but not very Episcopalian family in 1774, just as the American colonies edged toward revolution. And her family, by the way, called her Betsy. For some reason, I always like to share that. New York was barely a town then, and it extended just about a half-mile north of the Battery. And Elizabeth's father went hunting on Staten Island, and her brothers actually fished in the Hudson. And she was a child during the British occupation of the city, and her family suffered greatly. Everyone suffered. War brought fear and disease and dispossession. And by the time independence was won, Manhattanites were sheltering in shacks pieced together from ship's canvases and spars. So Elizabeth's family, though, had an additional problem, which was that they had not been patriots. They had been loyalists. So they'd chosen the wrong side, or at least the different side, and they had to overcome the contempt of the victors. And there was also a far more challenging issue for a deeper pain for Betsy. And that was that when she was only 3, her mother died, and a baby sister died not long after. And so Elizabeth and her older sister gained a stepmother when their father, Richard, remarried. But Charlotte was young and awkward, and she really had trouble caring for those 2 grieving girls. As Elizabeth grew, she and her sister were often sent to stay with an aunt and uncle, and they were very kind, but Elizabeth thought of home as where her father was. And her father, Richard Bayley, was a highly ambitious, scientifically minded doctor who devoted his life at some cost to his family, to figuring out the sources of the illnesses that plagued New York City in those days. Elizabeth loved him, and here's one of his accounts, but she knew she was not quite welcome in her stepmother and her father's home. And she was often unhappy, and in a way I sympathize with, she was unhappy with herself for being unhappy. And one night she even imagined drinking laudanum, which was an opiate very commonly used by physicians for a range of problems, but had she drunk enough, she would have fallen into unconsciousness or even died. And she frightened herself with that thought and felt grateful to God that she did not act on it. And I think sometimes when people hear of this, they're just so surprised that they insist, oh, it was just a passing fancy. And it's true, it was a passing thought, but she never forgot it. And if you look at her commonplace books, big heavy books like this, where she kept extracts and poetry that she loved, you see a mournful poem and a discoloration. And next to it in her hand are the words, "Tears the night of the little bottle." And that little bottle was the laudanum. And she never forgot what it was like to think even briefly that the world was better off without her. And she never forgot, in fact, any of that, any of her difficult childhood. And I think the compassion that she showed throughout her life grew from that soil. But then, age 18, 19, happiness, and she was quite lovely, as you can see. And we start to see the clues to this happiness in the archive of her life. "It is my intention to pass an hour with Mrs. Wilkes in the evening, where you may have the honor of seeing me, if you please," reads one jaunty note from Elizabeth Seton to a young man named William. "Mrs. Sadler is going to the concert and wishes very much to see us there. Do not be too late," comes another of Elizabeth's commands. So William was tall and handsome and several years older than Elizabeth, son of a successful merchant and a merchant himself. And he too had lost his mother young. He had a large number of half siblings via his father's second marriage. And William had lived in Italy. He'd worked in the merchant house of family friends. He loved music. Very soon he loved Elizabeth. And he did not call her Betsy, by the way, but Eliza. And one way we know that this is a love match is that it was completely impractical. So at this time in New York, people kind of lived in informal professional villages. And Elizabeth's sister, for example, married a physician who worked with Elizabeth's father. And William's father absolutely expected him to marry the good daughter of a good merchant and bring practical connections. Elizabeth brought nothing but herself, but William chose her. And Elizabeth, for her part, had always craved her father's attention, and she knew that entering this merchant world would draw her away from her father. And off she went, eagerly. And they were happy. It's so clear from their letters. They lived in a snug little house on Wall Street. That's not the house, but that's the street and the time period. And Elizabeth began bearing children. She had 5 of them, 2 boys and 3 girls, among them a ridiculous number of nicknames, which I only can keep straight because of the work of Sisters of Charity archivists. And New York had recovered by then. It was booming, but it was still a really tough place. A tough place where when firewood got expensive and you couldn't find work, you might freeze. And women were particularly vulnerable, unable to work in most jobs because of social convention. And a woman named Isabella Graham, there she is right there, a friend to Elizabeth, founded a poor widows society to help women and children struggling in a difficult economy when there really was no safety net but human kindness, and that was often in short supply. And I chose this image, by the way, because it shows Isabella Graham and also makes clear that this society persisted. This is a newspaper from the mid-20th century, but it still exists as Graham Wyndham. And Elizabeth worked hard with this society for several years, investing not only time, but compassion. And so we see her practicing love in the world. So these years were happy and fulfilling, but there was a shadow. Tuberculosis stalked the Seton family, and William began to cough and have fevers. And Elizabeth tried not to dwell on it, but she was observant, she was analytical, she was the daughter to a physician, and she knew. So when 1798 approaches, it's a difficult year. For the Setons, William and her father, like many businessmen then and now, used debt to keep their enterprise afloat, and that year the debts grew frightening. In short, it is tough and tough, William's father wrote his son one day. Our portion for this month of June makes my hair stand on end. And then one winter day, the elder Seton slipped on the ice right on his front stoop, and he was bedridden for weeks. I think he must have broken a hip. Elizabeth knew that the business was already in turmoil. A ship bearing of all things gold sank, further jeopardizing the business. And then, weeks after his fall, the elder Seton died. It was worse than Elizabeth could have imagined, because it turned out that despite weeks of decline and years of complicated transactions, the elder William had not left a will. And he'd never made his son privy to his decisions. And remember all of those half-siblings William had? They are all orphans now. And this young couple, Elizabeth, still in her 20s, is responsible for them. All but the very oldest had to live with them. And William and Elizabeth left their snug little house behind to take over their father-in-law's operation. She had to try to buck up William, who anxiously talked of business failures. "My Seton is in a distress of mind scarcely to be imagined," she wrote a friend, and sometimes she thought she might never have a moment to herself again. "We are and are likely to be in a state of confusion," she told a friend, "and where there is not peace, the mind loses all those delightful communications and reflections which mind so much depends on." And when she visited the house where she and her little family had lived just months before, she fell to her knees and she wept. But she got up and she carried on, and she found a good school for the older girls, and she taught the younger ones along with herself. She kept William's spirits up, and she also worked informally as his bookkeeper because love requires labor. "For one entire week, we wrote till 1 and 2 in the morning," she told a friend, and she did this while heavily pregnant. But none of it could stave off fate. Another ship sank, no one would accept William's promises to pay, and his business shuddered to a halt. The couple declared bankruptcy, and Elizabeth, having gone from this sort of young, affluent couple to that moment, found that she had to write up an inventory of all that she owned, linens, bedding, for the bankruptcy court, all of it exposed to public view. William's health broke entirely, and the couple, along with their oldest daughter, Anna Maria, at 8, already her mother's close companion, made a desperate voyage to Italy, hoping that the family that William had worked with would help save the business and the climate would help save his life. But they were quarantined on arrival in a cold stone building lashed by waves. And days after they were released, William died. Elizabeth had often felt that she might not survive her beloved husband's death. And yet, once again, she kept on. And it's during these days in Italy, right after William's death and in the company of her grief-stricken little daughter, that she fell in love with the Catholic faith, with the way it offered God's presence in the Eucharist, with the culture of saints, with the way heaven seemed to reach down to earth through the beauty of Florentine art and through simple gestures like the sign of the cross. And so she sailed back across the Atlantic, back to New York, struggled with uncertainty over what to do. And then, as I know you know, she did convert to Catholicism and did so here in Old St. Peter's. Okay, so at this moment, right after her conversion, she wanted to live in a completely Catholic world, or as close to it as she could find. And her first thought was French Canada. But in the end, she accepted the invitation of a clergyman named William de Bourgh to go to Maryland, where the country's largest Catholic community was. And she arrived in Baltimore and lived here in this little house on Paca Street, where you can still visit, and I hope you have or will. And the plan was to teach school. And she was grateful for this new start, living within the sound of the bells of St. Mary's, literally, with all her children near her. But soon, really amazingly soon, she was restless. So the life of a school teacher was part of what she wanted, but it was not all of what she wanted. It didn't feel like it allowed the full devotion to God and her new faith that she had imagined. And the clergy around her also thought that she could become more useful to the fledgling and quite mistrusted, at the time, American Catholic Church. So Elizabeth worked with Sulpician priests, with Bishop John Carroll, and with women, always with women, joined on to her vision in order to create the religious community that would take root in this beautiful place, Emmitsburg, and that would come to be known as the American Sisters of Charity. Here's another image of it from a clergyman of the time. It drew, as you know better than I, for its ethos and regulations on the Vincentian tradition, and was an apostolic community of women who lived lives of worship and service. And when the community was formally constituted and drawn up, the clergyman, John Dubois, translated Vincent de Paul's words into English. The sisters would have no cloister, but public streets or hospital rooms, no enclosure, but obedience, no great, but the fear of God, no veil, but that of holy modesty. And of course, from those beginnings grew so many religious communities. The Sisters of Charity Federation is comprised of 12 congregations. You see the numbers here, more than 2,000 sisters, and including associates and affiliates, more than 4,000 members. And among them, of course, are the Sisters of Charity of Seton Hill. And I can't resist saying that your connection to Mother Seton is such a lovely one, and it just requires 2 hops. And the first link is an original sister from the Emmitsburg community, Margaret George. This is not Margaret George. I do not have a good image of Margaret George, but this is Sister Judy Metz, who is a foremost historian of Margaret George and of most things, as far as I'm concerned. And Margaret George was, like Elizabeth Seton, a widow before she joined the community, and she was a loyal friend. And early in Seton's time in Emmitsburg, Elizabeth Seton had run afoul, more or less, of a male superior. And she was also very uncertain, and she worried she might be displaced entirely. And Margaret George found herself at a dinner party in Baltimore, seated near clergymen, and she spent the entire evening shamelessly eavesdropping, determined to bring back useful intel to Elizabeth Seton. And she did. And so after this, and after Elizabeth Seton's death, Margaret George helped to found the Sisters of Charity of Cincinnati. And in 1870, the Bishop of Pittsburgh asked those sisters to serve the growing Catholic community in his diocese. And as you know, from those beginnings and from the work of the founder, Mother Aloysia Lowe, grew the Sisters of Charity of Seton Hill, who I need hardly say, opened schools in any number of towns and neighborhoods, established a foundling and maternity asylum, a charity hospital, a school of nursing. I just chose some images that your archivists have wonderfully assembled. A boys' school where all the boys are looking just as tough as can be, I feel we must acknowledge. And of course, other work throughout the community, including at state correctional institutions, and created this marvelous institution, which grew into Seton Hill University. And here's an image from 1922, which just sort of spoke to me because it's a library. And in 1960, 4 sisters arrived in South Korea, beginning that vibrant ministry, and there are so many wonderful images of contemporary sisters. But I really can't resist sort of bragging that the sisters have a deep connection to my beautiful state of Arizona. And in the depths of the Great Depression, sisters arrived to staff St. Peter and Paul's School in Tucson, and went on to be involved in a number of ministries throughout the state. And again, just some lovely images that your archivists have brought together. Here is a barbecue. Here is a sister teaching school in Ajo in Arizona. I am told that the habits were changed to white because of what we might charitably call our abundance of sunshine here in Arizona. And here is a parade in Tucson honoring Mother Seton in 1959, which I loved because of the beautiful children. And also I feel in any group of children, you have one with that skeptical look on her face. And there she is right in that front corner embodying that. So I had to share her as well. So all of this has already been indirectly about Catholic social teaching, because these are women from the past and the present who live out those principles. But now in the second part of the talk, I'll turn to specific, although entirely inexpert, contemplation of 3 principles and the way they seem to me to be brought to life in Elizabeth Seton, in the way ordinary people have responded to this pandemic, and in the actions and legacy of sisters. So the first is a call to family, community, and participation. And the asterisk is just to remind me to confess that as I thought about this, I found it really impossible to keep the separate principles separate. So if it seems at any given point that I'm actually talking about a preferential option for the poor or anything else, yes, absolutely. So Elizabeth Seton really did live in a web of intermarried friends and relatives and business associates. She came from a large blended family, so did her husband. She cared for her own children and other people's children. And she wrote once that if she sneaked away, I hear a half dozen voices calling sister, mama. I love those passages, and there are a lot of them in Seton's archive. There is love in them and grace, and there's also, to me, a very human weariness. And Elizabeth Seton created a sense of family and community over and over again in her life, always out of difficult circumstances. In her stepmother's cold home, for the orphaned children of her father-in-law, for the sisters newly arrived and somewhat stunned in Emmitsburg. And that she did so each time at some cost to herself, who loved solitude, moves me greatly. And there's another sort of small example of her devotion to family that I would mention too. We know her difficult mother, stepmother, Charlotte, who married a man she really couldn't please and had children that she really couldn't quite nurture. Her husband, Elizabeth's father, left Charlotte, and some of Charlotte's children fell into a kind of disarray, or at least disaffection. By her mid-40s, she was alone and she was desperately sick. And she asked Elizabeth, this stepdaughter who had every reason to keep a distance, to tend her. And Elizabeth tended her absolutely without hesitation and lovingly. So, thinking now of the current moment, I think that it is clear that this year has also thrown families back on top of each other, living and eating and working together in ways that modern families generally don't always anymore. So there have been these endless opportunities to care for each other and learn more about each other. And I think also a lot of moments in which we might have rethought our decision to choose an open floor plan, or we've kind of run out of the house and taken up jogging. And so just a few images of that from our archive. This is something that a gentleman uploaded, and he was actually saying that he had got the hang of it, that he had his children in order, that he loved homeschooling, that his house was clean. I was so astonished by this. And then as I read the entry more closely, I realized he's literally a drill sergeant. His job is to be a drill instructor of Parris Island with the Marines. I thought perhaps that gave him some insight into creating order out of chaos. And on a more serious note, people also really confess their exhaustion. So here's a woman who wrote, "I'm exhausted and drained. I feel like I have no more to give. I don't want to get out of bed, but I have an obligation I can't ignore. So I continue to give, even as tears run down my face." And I thought that this woman is struggling in a way Elizabeth Seton would have deeply understood. And I hope that she finds compassion from those around her. And there is a kind of generosity in just sharing one's own vulnerability as she did. And somewhat in between those is this family, and this mother, this lovely mother, wrote that she had absolutely no idea what she was going to do for Halloween, and the kids were unhappy. They weren't going to be allowed to trick or treat. And so she came up with the idea of just taking and dressing them up like Harry Potter, putting them in the backyard. And then she made a careful trip to the store. She brought candy and she put bowls behind each door of the house and stationed a stuffed animal next to the bowl as the neighbor. And then the children trick-or-treated inside the house. And I just thought, and she said they loved it. And of course we know they did love it. I just thought that was so beautiful, just such generosity and creativity. So as I learned to and read about Sisters of Charity of Seton Hill for this talk, I was struck by the fact that many of the older sisters emerged from quite large families in the early 20th century. And I'm going to share two images with you of sisters from the beautiful in memoriam pages that the community has put up. And I'm just telling you so that I don't put these lovely faces up without warning. So first, here is Sister Anne Flynn, whose memorial lists 12 brothers and sisters, and who emerged from that large family to serve the wide world, earning a degree in history, a graduate degree in religious studies, and serving, there's no way to do it justice, faculty member, retreat and renewal center director, director of religious education, and on it goes. And I was also moved by the fact that families had given the world more than one sister of charity. And so here is Sister Mary Gertrude McElhaney, who also had a remarkably full career as teacher and principal. And she also, as I read this, had a sister, 2 maternal aunts, and 3 cousins who were or are Sisters of Charity, including Sister Vivian Linkauer. So these are women who, like Elizabeth Seton, lived their lives with voices calling sister, right? With hands reaching out to them. And the lines between family and community blur. And in fact, there are just so many ways in which sisters throughout the Federation serve community. Here's just one image among thousands that I could show. And I also learned a wonderful recent story, which begins here with the town of Greensburg planning a campaign called Honoring Our Heroes. And the whole point of this official national campaign was to honor members of the armed forces and first responders, who of course are absolutely worth honoring. But as I understand it, members of the Seton Hill community pointed out that others also are heroic and sent along a photograph. And here's where we are now with Mother Aloysia Lowe honored throughout the town of Greensburg. So that banner honors a founder who created community clearly, but really the act of sending that photograph was an act of such generosity to the community, reminding everyone in that moment and everyone as they walk through the town that those who serve and nurture are also heroes. And because I'm hopelessly an historian, I have to now take us back 103 years to another time when disease raced through the world and no one knew then how many it would claim and when it would stop. And I think a pandemic is in some ways the intensification of the challenge and blessing of community. Pandemics happen because we as people are both dangerous and necessary to each other. The very fact that we walk together and sing together and shake hands and break bread means disease can take root. And then we try to hide from each other to save ourselves. But of course, we don't save ourselves that way. Not our bodies and not our minds and hearts, which languish without company. And in-person company too, right? As wonderful as Zoom is, I think I sometimes feel that if I never see another screen full of little boxed people, one of them with that palm tree background, and we all are gently making that you're on mute gesture as somebody talks away, right? It will be soon enough. But we are grateful for Zoom, and we're fortunate to have antibiotics and vaccines and even respirators. And the sisters of 1918 had none of those things, and yet they served and nursed so bravely. And Pennsylvania was among the hardest hit of all the American states. Sisters and Daughters of Charity by then already had a history of working during epidemics, including dreadful cholera epidemics in the 19th century. And they worked selflessly during this utterly terrifying pandemic. And here's just a document that shows, again, your archivists have found, that shows admissions day after day after day. And tragically, that some of these individuals died within days of being admitted as you trace the names through. Here are some of the sisters who volunteered during that pandemic. And here, kind of looping together this whole section, is a lovely letter from the chairman of the local Red Cross, in which he thanks the sisters for relieving the pain and suffering of an afflicted community. And he writes, and this is in 1919, "We believe the courage and valor you have shown is equal to that of our boys in frontline service." So 100 years earlier, the same sentiment that led to Mother Aloysia Lowe in the streets of Greensburg. And clearly these teachings, as I said, flow into each other. Caring for the sick means caring for the poor and vulnerable, because the sick are by definition vulnerable, and also because those who have fewer resources, who may already be cold or hungry or just tired, fall ill faster, and they have fewer ways to get well. And so caring requires not just generous spirits, but keen minds, It requires analysis as well as love, or as we saw in Elizabeth Seton's life, analysis that is itself a kind of love. And in that way, here is the sister's statement on the equitable distribution of COVID-19 vaccine, which seemed an example of this teaching. So this, I think, can bring us to a second principle, which is solidarity. And that teaching urges us to see our commonalities, and in doing so, it acknowledges our differences. And what we do about those differences as we strive toward union is no easy matter, at least to me, a simple historian. And here's an example from the archive of COVID-19. I had this up on my screen while I was writing this talk, and a colleague of mine walked into my office and he just gasped. Literally, I heard him gasp. And to him, it was an image of conflict. And when I reassured him that the person who uploaded it said it was, no, this is an image of coexistence, he was happier, but still a little uneasy. And he said, but one side is right. And without getting into which side he thought was right, without getting into partisanship at all, I think we can acknowledge that this is something we all have to think about. We have to think about how to find solidarity in a space of justice, right? Solidarity that creates common ground, that is solid ground, because everyone is invited to it. And there's another way in which seeking solidarity requires more than goodwill, and that's in acknowledging the reality of difference. And when I was a child, I was taught, for example, that not seeing color was ideal. And I've learned that this meant sometimes, not always, but sometimes, failing to see parts of other people's lives and experience that are immensely important to them, or that might require of me that I contemplate my own life or change my own life. So as I thought about the complexity that hides within this simple word of solidarity, I thought again of Elizabeth Seton and how she sought connection and commonality within difference. And I think it's possible to see this in her changing sense of how to live amidst the spiritual diversity of her world. In her early life, she was pretty unruffled by it. She didn't have any desire to change other people's spiritual views. She had no desire for convergence. But when she first began to take true comfort in Christianity, she really wanted to talk other people into joining her. And at the very first, she did this in a way that caused conflict with her family and friends. And as the years passed, she learned to do it in different ways. She absolutely still believed that the faith that she'd found brought solace and beauty and a path that she wanted others to find. But she developed a way of living out its truth while accepting that others would find their own way. So the solidarity she created was not through agreement, but through love. It strikes me as a quite different matter. All of which is just to say that human beings don't seem to me to fit together perfectly. They don't form neat, solid blocks. And yet, clearly, solidarity is something that we need to strive for. And looking outward from Seton to our own time, we see a need for solidarity, a quest for solidarity in the face of racial difference and racism that is evident throughout American history because of our failures throughout American history. And as many have observed, the pandemic just flows through the channels that history has already carved, so that it has hit African Americans and Latinos harder with higher infections and death rates, more job losses, and more business closures. Asian Americans have sometimes faced terrifying attacks or abuse. And we see efforts to respond to this throughout the COVID-19 archive and the sisters' works. And here is a child's drawing that an adult actually uploaded, and it just says, "Justice for George Floyd," and then at the bottom, "We are sorry for the Floyds." And we are. And here is another image that someone uploaded to the archive. And he writes, "This is my picture taken at a march." And he says, "That's me with the white towel around my neck." During this pandemic, the majority of America has been focusing on getting back to normal. For most of us Black Americans, the pandemic has been another setback to deal with in our pursuit of life, liberty, and the American dream. This is a pursuit that has been going on all of our lives, the lives of our ancestors, and almost assuredly the generations that will come. My hope is that when people look back and search COVID-19 and the pandemic, they will look at the totality of the struggles of Black Americans. I want them to understand that our fight and struggle to live has been and will always be more resilient than the forces opposing us, no matter if it's a viral agent or humans. So I want them to understand, right? This absolute cry from the heart. Solidarity emerges from truly seeing people and seeing differences, whether those differences are made through history or made in the privacy of hearts and minds. And the sister's statement is long and complicated, and I'm sure all of you have already read it, but it did seem appropriate to bring it forth here. It's so clearly a profound statement of purposeful solidarity. We unite with those of goodwill. We affirm that Black lives matter. This is where the charity of Christ compels us to stand, and we invite all to join us here. But this, of course, has been going on for decades, and there seems no better example of it to me than the Sisters of Charity of Seton Hill's longtime relationship with the Sisters of the Holy Family. And that beautiful expression of solidarity was, of course, made necessary by its opposite, by the ugly exclusions of race that have been so dominant. The Sisters of the Holy Family, founded in 1842, were African-American sisters who, by the early 20th century, had already for decades taught African-American children in the South under the most challenging conditions. And then as states added a requirement that teachers be certified, the sisters found themselves excluded from programs that would have enabled them to gain that certification. And so in response, Sisters of Charity of Seton Hill created in 1921 a summer course, and sisters traveled to Louisiana and did so for decades. And there is so much required from everyone in this story. This is the Seton Hill sisters' willingness to travel to a part of the country that they most certainly did not know, to do so at a time when other whites were more than willing to use violence or abuse to maintain segregation. And the Sisters of the Holy Family, what was required of them in order to create this solidarity? Just their faithful willingness to work within such a profoundly imperfect nation and an imperfect church, the graciousness of their communication with the Seton Hill sisters, when the galling reasons that they needed assistance would have made bitterness so completely understandable, or at least to someone as frail as myself. And the Sisters of Charity of Seton Hill, clearly, they always speak and write of what they have learned and what they have gained from this relationship, as well as acknowledging what they have given. And there's one little moment, again, which an archivist and a student at Seton Hill brought forth in their account of it, which I just so love, in which Mother Claudia writes, "The last few years we have given courses, we have been convinced they do not need our help. They have able sisters with higher degrees qualified to take care of any courses." That is so beautiful to me, living, and working within an institution that tends to reproduce itself. But these are people who recognize that one has to learn to give in a different way, or even to receive. And what matters is not one's own sense of one's usefulness or of what one knows how to do, but rather a true understanding of the other person's needs, the other person's personhood. So thinking about all of this and about Elizabeth Seton and the young people at my university and yours working so hard to create meaningful and just communities, I am just struck that solidarity is not simple and not something that can be achieved and preserved, but it requires this delicate, constant attention to others that Elizabeth Seton herself always demonstrated. And here is another wonderful, because could you tell I just couldn't stop pulling images, another wonderful example of the ongoing nature of this relationship, and you will recognize some faces. So finally, and just in the last few minutes, I promise, I'll just alight on this last central teaching dignity of the human person, which I think has clearly lain at the heart of our struggle and of the moments of grace during the pandemic. The year has seen so many instances of tender care for others, for family, for community, between strangers linked by nothing else but a belief that life is to be tended. And I do not need to say that the year has also seen bitter arguments and angry claims that the value of life is not being measured properly, or that expression that life matters is somehow an expression that it doesn't matter. Claims that too much sacrifice is being demanded, or perhaps too little. It is exhausting. And I think it is most exhausting when family or community seem at risk and there seems no sincere and sure way to work toward the good. And here again, Elizabeth Seton's example is of use. Because of the work her spiritual daughters did in preserving her letters and writing, we know that her sainthood emerged out of struggle and uncertainty. Not uncertainty about her love of God or of others, but uncertainty over what that love required of her at any given moment. Over how to be both fearless and gentle, how to insist on the pursuit of truth while also seeking harmony, how to be both honest and kind. And I think Elizabeth Seton's conviction of the dignity of the human person lay at the center and was completely entwined with her sense of human frailty. And that sense came from her own deep sense of her own frailty. So this life that to us is so glorious, so triumphant, which is so glorious and so triumphant, as she saw it, she always proved less able to avoid conflict than she hoped, more often deprived of a sense of God's presence than she'd imagined, more judgmental than she wished. But what she lost in confidence, she gained in compassion. And so she created an ethos not of detachment, as some elements of monastic tradition might have counseled, but of connection. And that was not only because her life as a woman made detachment impossible, though it surely did. It was also because she actively cultivated human connection at every turn. I am not enabled as Jesus Christ to do miracles for others, she wrote, but I may constantly find occasions of rendering them good offices and exercising kindness and goodwill toward them. And those offices consisted of specific, loving attention to others. One was obligated, she taught, to see and listen to each human being, even if children were pulling at our skirts or ships filled with gold were sinking, because they usually are. And even if the person is difficult or alien in some way, because of course we always are. Near the end of her life, Seton wrote that she asked herself, am I indeed in full charity with all? And it was only after listening to contemporary sisters that I really heard the grammar and the meaning of that sentence more clearly. Charity with, not charity toward. Charity not bestowed upon, but emerging from relationship, with no one person the instrument of another. I have been so grateful these years to think about these ideas and these women. And I am grateful for this opportunity to share something of what I have learned, what you, I suspect, already knew with you tonight. So there you are.
Well, Catherine, thank you so very much. And again, if anyone has any questions, please use the chat function. I do have one that came in to me so far, and it's maybe a practical question, a historical practical question, and that is on William Seton's portrait. His name was spelled S-E-A-T-O-N. So where does that Seton versus the Seton that we know, how does that come about?
Someone, perhaps all of you, have very sharp eyes. But before I get to that, I did just want to say that please, thank you so much for comments. please feel free just to say things too. There's no reason that all of this needs to be directed to questions at me, right? You all have tremendous things to say, so as you wish. As for Seton, in the Scottish tradition and also in American sources, it goes back and forth between EA and E for generations. And in fact, I learned to search through newspapers both for EA and for E because they were both used. Elizabeth and William themselves consistently spelled it SETON, but others not. And in fact, spelling in the 18th century was fairly improvisational. I sometimes think a lot of my students would have been happier human beings in the 18th century because one could spell and capitalize as one wished, and there weren't small-minded people such as myself telling them there was just one way. But Seton is an example of that.
And also, we have in the chat, one of our members of the audience found the website for the Mother Seton House, if anyone wants to look at that. That's in the chat here. Also, just some comments. Wonderful. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you so much for such a rich talk. Again, another thank you, Sublime. Amazing. Thank you so much. I feel inspired and humbled. Lots of thanks.
Undeserved, but thank you.
Someone mentions my favorite is charity with, not charity to. So I think that's a lovely sentiment as well. Here's a message. Catherine, I'm so struck by the ways you lifted up Elizabeth's frailty. It seems exactly the message we need to hear these days. Thanks to you. Can you talk more about that? And I think this past year has, for so many of us, we felt so frail at times. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, oh, of course. And thank you, Sister Tina, without so many of you, the no book on Elizabeth Seton could be written. Yes, because we have so many letters and writings of her throughout her life, we just can see these various struggles. So I mentioned the fact that she loved quiet and reading and time to think, and yet was compelled to help and live in community, and that was a challenge. Early in her life, she feared loving people, and it was because she had known loss from so early, right? Her mother dies when she's 3, loss is all around her, her husband is ill, and she writes basically that she's going to try to love within constraints, because maybe that will make life less difficult. The fear of losing people or the reality of losing people. And I just find that so moving as someone afraid of loss myself and constantly scheming to avoid loss. And of course, she, though, being Elizabeth Seton, set it aside and in fact literally wrote later in her life, fear nothing so much as not to love enough. But that's another example of frailty. And then the one more example, and then please others should join in. When she first started at Emmitsburg, my sense is that she felt that she had to act out a role that she didn't quite yet feel she inhabited, so that she had never been a novice, certainly never lived in community at all. And then there she was, Mother Seton, leading others. And she had to do it, and she did do it. You can tell that the people around her had absolute confidence in her, but she was struggling. Was she the right person? Was she in communion with God? It was just so difficult. And that frailty and vulnerability, and yet her absolute conviction, not just to keep doing the practical things, but to keep living generously, is really miraculous to me.
We have a person who would like to know if there is a link to the COVID journal, the digital archives entries that you talked about throughout the presentation.
Yes, I should have been clever enough to have that available. If someone does a Google search for Journal of the Plague Year, COVID-19, it will come up. The Journal of the Plague Year is because I'm a hopeless professor, and it's a reference to a very old novel by Daniel Defoe. But if someone, there you go. Thank you, Christine. So that's it. And people have been so generous. And again, it's my colleagues who knew how to do the software and so forth. But we've got entries from Australia, a lot from Peru and Colombia, from all over the United States, from Canada. So it's quite something. Stories to tell.
We have a comment. I love the opening where you said you were not here as an expert, though you are, but as a witness. So thank you for bearing witness for us.
Oh, thank you. No, it's just, I mean, you probably heard that I had difficulty ending this talk. And in fact, you know, as I read and looked at the archives and so forth, the whole last couple of weeks, I've just had tears streaming down my face fairly regularly, because it's just such a wonderful world of contributions you've created.
And a question, what do you think Elizabeth would think of her legacy today?
Oh, what an interesting question. So, I would love to hear others' views. See, I want to go into professor mode and just start calling on people to force people to jump in. I guess that's not appropriate. So what I will say is, she did have a hope that her story would be of use to others, right? There was no ego involved in this at all. It was that perhaps her story could be of use to others. And she understood that the clergy around her were thinking in those ways. Some of her spiritual daughters were thinking in those ways. I don't think anyone could have imagined how large and vibrant the various communities grew, how many contributions they planted throughout the world. I think that the ways I have heard people talk to me about Elizabeth Seton, which has been another privilege of this project, would be moving to her. People who see her as a single mother, right? Which she was. People see her as a woman juggling all kinds of responsibilities, which she was. Someone devoted to helping others. I find that people who even can be a little resistant to her at first, they are fascinated by the fact that she changed her mind throughout her life. So that, if you have an idea of kind of a saint as having one idea and perfection and just an absolute through line, right? This is a woman who thought and rethought and questioned and decided, no, that's not really the way I want to do this. Or, oh, I hadn't learned about this. Or, oh, I need to continue to change and become more gentle. This is just a constant thing that she thought about. I think that legacy is tremendously valuable. And also and connected to that, her legacy of living amidst a complicated, diverse world, right? Holding to a truth. Absolutely. She thought some things were right and some lives were to be lived in one way and not other ways, but she also appreciated the diversity of human expression. She understood that people find their way. And that, I think, is just such a valuable legacy, especially now.
Thank you. We have also a comment about a line that you delivered during your talk, which struck me. Could you say this again? We are dangerous and necessary to each other. You said this when you shifted to what is current when COVID hit, and it was so profound how your words spoke about this paradox. Frailty, vulnerability, love, and heroism seem related to being about to be in and survive in this paradox.
There is no reason for me to restate what I said, because that is such a beautiful elaboration of it. Absolutely. I mean, we're all that we need, and we are all that we can destroy, and we can destroy each other. It's all true at the same time. And living within that, and as Elizabeth Seton wrote, not being afraid to love, right? Not being afraid to connect is so valuable. And the one of the most excruciating things I think we all felt as the pandemic started was that the very ways that we wanted to help people were the ways that we could not, right? By bringing them food, by taking care of their children, by visiting, by touching. It's just the preciousness of the connections that we usually have were brought home because we lost them right when we most needed them. But it has been immensely moving to me to see the ingenuity, right? The Zoom and the virtual concerts and there in the archives, there's people making sandwiches and wrapping them carefully and leaving them, like they say, the thing is called socially distanced sandwiches, right? Or all these ways of serving each other and reconstituting community. And I think sometimes what we had most to offer each other, at least in the circles I travel in, was admitting I'm not particularly good at this, right? Or I'm worried I'm not serving my family well. Or in my case, I have a teenage daughter who, is just this vibrant, happy kid, and now she's, it's just a different world for her, right? And she did fine, but sharing those struggles, I think, and I was so grateful when other people shared their struggles, but yeah, difficult and beautiful year.
Another comment, Elizabeth is a saint for all people, which I think is a lovely sentiment as well.
Yes, I'm glad someone said that. Absolutely.
That is actually the end of the comments in the chat. If anyone else has other questions or comments to make, please feel free. One thing that I wanted to mention is, Catherine, as you spoke about 1918 and the work that the sisters did in that year during the influenza pandemic. 1918 was also the year that Seton Hill College was founded. So in the midst of a pandemic, they were also founding this institution. So I think that's a remarkable piece of history.
What an act of faith, absolutely. So
I do have another question. Can you speak to what being Catholic was like during Elizabeth's time? It was not an easy existence for her to choose.
That is a wonderful question, Jen Jones. You are absolutely right. So there were not many Catholics in the United States at that time. Most of the ones that there were in Maryland, and there were some in New York. There was this one parish, and Catholicism was mistrusted. It was mistrusted in a way, for example, that Islam would be mistrusted centuries later. The thought was that a Catholic could not be a good American. And that was because Catholics were thought to be loyal first to Rome, and also were thought to just mindlessly follow the directions of priests. Catholic priests felt that this was not, in fact, the problem. But that was the argument. And so in Seton's time, all of that was in the air. There had not yet been the mass immigration of my people, the Irish. So you didn't quite have that sense of ethnic prejudice, although that was building, but you had a mistrust of Catholics. So absolutely, when she decided, it was more of like a realization than a decision. Like when she realized that she wanted to be Catholic, this was a change of faith, but it was absolutely, and she knew it, a change in her life and her children's lives as well. Because as a widow, how as a widow do you reestablish a household? You remarry, right? That was one of the very few options. And if she became Catholic, it was going to be infinitely harder for her to remarry, right? That was just a really difficult proposition. And she also knew that she would try the patience of some of her family. Now, her family were more gentle than kind of the mythology that built up around it suggests. But some of them were quite troubled, and they were all kind of astonished. And she returned to the United States with one of the Felici brothers, Antonio. It was quite dashing. And Antonio arrived with Elizabeth Seton as a kind of chaperone to help bolster her in this decision. But some of her family wrongly thought that he was just there to keep her talked into this decision, and that she, had just been led down the path. Well, no one led Elizabeth Seton down any path. They really, really should have known better. But so there was this combination then of distaste for Catholicism that she faced, uncertainty from her own family, and then just the simple fact that she would have to find a new way of life. But Catholicism also offered, and the Vincentian tradition offered her a way of living that Protestantism did not. So setting aside doctrine just for the moment, a way of life in which she could devote herself to her faith and also to good works. And she could establish a school. And then another sister, Rose White, could essentially become a consultant and go from Emmitsburg to Philadelphia and then to New York, opening up an orphanage in each place and getting it running. This is just an astonishing thing for a woman of that era to do, and to be able to use all of her gifts, practical and spiritual. And it was the Catholic Church that had that possibility within it. And Protestantism, as Elizabeth Seton knew it, did not. That was a super long answer. That'll teach you to ask me another question.
Wonderful. Any other questions? Feel free to ask. We have, we do have a comment, and then a question about the comment. So although I'm no longer a vowed Sister of Charity, I still live by the motto, Caritas Christi Unget Nos. And the question is, Grace, what does this motto mean? Sorry, I am not familiar. So perhaps one of our sisters could, Sister Maureen perhaps could talk about that motto.
No, I was just saying that the motto, Caritas Christi Urget Nos, translated is the charity of Christ urges us. And I truly believe that the daughters of Elizabeth have lived that motto, not just as a motto, but in action throughout these many years. So thank you for that comment.
Well, thank you all so much. I mean, thank you is a small word for what I feel and what I owe. So it's such a privilege and just so wonderful. words fail me, but thank you again.
Thank you, Catherine. We really enjoyed and appreciated your time with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President Finger.
Took me a while to find my unmute button. Catherine, thank you very much. I knew you could make all of those connections, the connections of Elizabeth and her life and her attitude and what you called an ethos of connection, and connect it to the bigger world and our world. And I think that is a great gift. We don't always see those connections. And pointing out Elizabeth's frailty and her acknowledgement of that frailty at a time when so many people are feeling used up and worn out and facing their own frailty. Those are real gifts. You also offer us the Journal of the Plague Year, and that just struck me as very connected to the whole challenge of being Catholics who are trying to live Catholic social teaching, because that requires us to have the big picture, the global sense. And the journal gives all of us who've heard you tonight a chance to look and see the faces of people all over the world affected as we have been affected, but uniquely in their circumstance, and to care about the big world and not just sit back and say, well, I'm busy with my own things and those people don't matter. Of course they matter. And Mother Seton talked about being a citizen of the world. And we are called also to be citizens of the world in that sense of caring about the dignity of the person, caring about solidarity. And I love that idea. Solidarity requires that we look for the commonalities, but also recognize the differences and not try to, whitewash some of that. So this time continues to challenge us, and whatever normal we get to, we'll still be challenged. And hopefully, like Mother Seton, we've learned and grown in all of this. Well, I thank you for all the ways in which you've held a mirror up, as you said, so that we can see our situation, but also see it with Elizabeth right there beside us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sister.
And I think at that point we can say good night to everybody and thank you for coming. I had thought earlier, this is virtual, but no less vital. And so I'm glad. Thank you and good night, everybody.